All right, welcome back to principle number 4, and this will actually make you understand the last point also about hyperfocal distance in case you got confused, because this kind of goes hand in hand. So this principle is about aperture, and since the last principle was about focusing, aperture and focusing, as you're going to find out, are related to each other in a way. Okay, so we're also going to be talking about basically the settings that you will be using when you take your landscape shot, and aperture perhaps is obviously very important because that is related to depth of field. So let's take a quick example. So let's just take this normal shot here, and let's say from whatever we've learned in the last video about the hyperfocal distance, remember, this will be a good exercise for you. If I was to ask you that, you're seeing this through your camera and this is the scene, where should your focus point be? Okay, so let's, last time we learned that, let's be approximate about this. So 1/3 from the bottom up. So let's say around maybe somewhere here. Okay, so we can say, maybe let's say we put our focus point. So this is where our camera is basically going to be focusing. Now, wherever you focus, yes, that's right, that we've learned, okay, this is near the hyperfocal distance. This is the correct point to focus. So the depth of field will start to get shared between this part and this part. That means these areas will start to be in focus. That's what we have learned till now. But if your f-stop number is less, like for example, yes, I can get this point right, I'm at the correct hyperfocal distance, but let's say I'm shooting at f4, okay, where it's a small f-stop number, that means it's a wider aperture, so the depth of field is shallow, kind of the depth of fields that we use in portrait shots to blur the background. What's going to happen is, yes, you still have got this point correct at around 1/3 of the frame, but since this is f4, it'll only stretch a bit, so maybe you won't get like this whole area in focus. You'll just maybe get around this much in focus, okay? So a lot of your foreground and a lot of your background will actually go out of focus. So it'll completely depend on wherever you place the focus point, because depth of field is like, think of it like this, is the epicenter that it generates around wherever you have focused, okay? But how much of it generates, that depends on your f-stop number. So both of them are related, right? They go hand in hand. That's what I mean. Now, that's why obviously in landscape photography, what do we use? We use a higher f-stop number. Now, one of the mistakes you can make is that, Kush, can't I just use something like f32 or f29, and then I won't even need to care about the hyperfocus, because like everything from top to bottom, then the whole scene will be just in focus. Yes, your thinking is correct, that the higher the f-stop number, the deeper the depth of field and everything will be in focus. But there's something that you have to understand about lenses, okay? And one of the issues is that at either extremes, so let's say something like from f22 onwards, you can say, so f22, f29, and even if your lens allows more than that, these are slightly on the the narrower extremes, and also on the shallower extremes, which actually we won't care about, but still you should know this. At either of these extremes, lenses basically become soft. Okay, what that means is they lose a lot of sharpness. So in landscape photography, if we use these, yes, we get a deeper depth of field, but what you'll find is when you notice the edges in your shots and you notice a lot of things, you might find a lot of issues, and this is actually called as diffraction. This phenomenon where your shots just become slightly soft. Okay, that means they lose a bit of sharpness at these extreme narrow f-stop numbers is called diffraction. Okay, so you want to avoid this also, even though it generates more depth of field. Now, what is the correct f-stop number? That is the idea. I've done a lot of research on this. I'll also tell you which one I usually use, but I also have to tell you what a lot of the best photographers use. Now, according to me, and I'm always on the lookout for this. Whenever I see a good landscape shot, I always look if the data is available so that I can just see the f-stop number being used. And I find that f11 is perhaps the most used aperture, the f-stop number. Okay, now this kind of gives you a good balance between depth of field, and it also saves you from this diffraction issue. Now you might be thinking, but Kush, won't it happen that then some of the parts here and maybe some parts behind, so behind is not such a problem like we discussed before, but definitely maybe some of the parts in front here in the foreground can get a bit soft. But remember, we are going to be learning about focus stacking. But the good part will be when you use f11, your lens is very sharp. So whatever you do capture, it's going to be very sharp. And then you can focus once here, and maybe once at the back and combine these three shots also. And a lot of times, even f11 generates enough deep depth of field to cover most of it. Okay, so I would say f11 is perhaps the most that I see. I am a bit of a pessimist in this. So what I do is when I usually shoot, I slightly take it higher. Okay, so I usually like to be between f13 to f16. Sometimes, to be frank, I even go to f22. I've taken a lot of shots at f22. So don't think that the shot will be completely waste. No, there's diffraction you can only notice when you really zoom into the shot. Sometimes photographers also make a big deal of it. Okay, it's more important when you're printing out a big shot, then definitely. But if you're just going to share it on social media, even if you've clicked on these higher apertures, it doesn't matter. It's just that I have to tell you these things. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, usually we say keep your f-stop number between f8 to f16. A lot of photographers even like to use f8. The reason for that is lenses usually are the sharpest at f8 aperture. Okay, that's just how it is. But of course, then there is a bit of compromise on the depth of field. So a lot of photographers who will use f8, they'll get the sharpest photos, but they usually will also sometimes, if they're facing the soft out of focus foreground especially, they will stack the photos by taking multiple shots. Okay, so let's say when we go out and we take our shot, we'll try to stick to somewhere in between, okay, the suggested range. So maybe f13, f15, f16, whatever we feel. Okay, it's not such a big deal, but just remember also avoid extremes like this. Apart from that, the other settings are basically going to be your ISO, which usually stays at the base. So landscape photography settings wise is not so tough, okay, because you usually leave your ISO at the base value to get the cleanest image, and you just save all the light from shutter speed. So you keep on reducing your shutter speed, make it slower till the time you save, because usually movement is not a problem, because if it's water, if it's some clouds and all, the movement, actually the blur that your shutter speed generates, a slow shutter speed, is actually comes in the realm of long exposure photography. It's actually desirable. The only exception to this can be, let's say there was something in the foreground which, or maybe somewhere in the scene which is moving and you want it and slightly moving fast, like maybe some fields which were moving because of the wind, and you wanted to use a faster shutter speed, then of course the only way out will be, because you also lost light because of the narrower aperture, right? You also lost light because of a faster shutter speed. Then those kind of shots you have to shoot at a higher ISO. Okay, so you'll have to raise your ISO and it might result in a bit of noise. That's why more than 90% of the landscape shots, you'll find that either they're taken off areas where there's no movement, or if the movement is to be captured like of water, like in front of you, like how you're seeing, the blur anyway is desirable. Okay, anyway, we will cover all this later on, because we will take a lot of shots where you will actually see all this happening. This was mainly about aperture, and I hope now also you understand that how it is kind of related to the focusing area, or the exact point where you will be focusing on. So both of them will go together in order to make a sharp shot. All right, so I hope you got that. Let's move on to the next principle.